Is this too ominous? Yeah, this works. Yeah, let's do this. There's been a lot of horror about trauma, psychological trauma, family trauma. Hereditary is about family trauma to a similar extent. Midsummer is about family trauma. The Witch is about patriarchal violence and patriarchal expectations, which in itself is a kind of trauma. Get Out was about the trauma of being othered, being black, a black body in a white supremacist country. So we see horror tackling all these things, which it should. That's what it's there for. That's what it's meant to. Usually when we see the immigrant experience, especially the black immigrant experience kind of on film, it's usually like a very, you know how you see those ads that are like, give an African orphan 5 cents so that he can eat a shoe or something. And the tone of them are meant to make you pity, and the tone of them are also meant to make you feel like kind of a savior and make you feel like a father figure. It's kind of like you are taking on the role of taking care of somebody who cannot take care of themselves. You rarely see the immigrant black experience portrayed on film with any kind of agency. And for me, what horror does so well is that it allows you to play with power, especially when you feel powerless, and just kind of explore things that we don't usually talk about in any like real terms. So his house is 2 levels. There's 2 levels to this, because I think when you're talking about reading a film, there's always kind of 2 levels. It's what is the film literally about, and then what is the aboutness of the film. What is the film kind of thematically about? What is going on underneath that surface? So his house is about, literally is about a couple who flees South Sudan during a crisis. Their people are being massacred by another group, and they like need to get the fuck out of there. So they get the fuck out of there. They travel by sea. This is something that a lot of immigrants who leave countries that have been ravaged by like colonialism, especially, or by mostly colonialism. Yeah, mostly colonialism. This is like a story that a lot of immigrants, not every immigrant gets on a plane and enters a country and kind of stays there for long enough and works and gets their papers and all that, and we know this. So they experience a humanitarian crisis, and the British government is like, we will take you in all of our like big heart, big country kindness. We'll take you in. And so they're put in this facility, and they have to wait until they're told that they are going to be given a chance to become part of this country. You're going to be given a new life. Except it's kind of like a probation, right? That's the trick, is that you don't just get to like, you know, you're not just given a space to kind of start your life over, even though you've experienced something traumatic. You're not given the space to kind of process that trauma with all your needs met. You're kind of they plopped this couple in the outskirts of like a shitty house, essentially. There's holes in the walls, and it's run down, and they're living here. It's important to note that their neighbors, their immediate neighbors, are like a lot of white people, a lot of, I guess, poor white people. But you can see that already these are like 2 different situations. You kind of see like people who are considered undesirables being grouped into the same areas but having very different experiences, because this couple moves into this area with other low-income people, but like they're treated like they're dirt, they're treated like they're rats, they're treated like they don't belong there. And that's the message that they're getting. It's like, you have to show us that you can belong. These are the conditions of being able to stay in this house and being allowed to like essentially to becoming actual citizens. So there's 2 parts of this couple. It's Ball and Rial. Ball is the man figure, Rial is the woman figure. And Ball and Rial kind of experience are having 2 different kind of experiences. Ball wants to assimilate. Ball wants to go through the motions. He wants to be one of the good ones. That's a line literally said in the film. We want to see that you're one of the good ones, essentially. He wants to be one of the good ones. He doesn't want to eat his food with his hands. He wants to sit at a table instead of on the floor like he would do if he was back in his country. He wants to sing football songs. He wants to, smile at everybody, and he wants to be polite, and he wants to be non-threatening more than anything. And Rial is like, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do any of that shit. I don't want to eat with a fork and knife. It tastes like metal and I don't like it. And I don't want to wear those clothes. I think they are stupid. And I don't want to sugarcoat anything, and I don't want to pretend like everything's gonna be fabulous and fucking mash and fucking gravy. I don't want to do that. And so they're at odds here. And while all that is happening, while this kind of external conflict is going on, the house is, I should have given spoiler alert, but how are we gonna talk about this? I'm gonna spoil the film. While all this is going on, while they're kind of butting heads in that way, their house is literally being haunted. They're living in a haunted house. There are ghosts and shit in the wall. Ball is experiencing horrific flashbacks and horrific images of trying to cross fucking the ocean and shit to get to the UK. And people died, and he witnessed people dying. And Rial is like, I know what the fuck this is. There's something that has followed us here. Something that has followed us here, and this is a creature, an apeth. Yeah, this is a creature that deals in that is a deal maker, that keeps a balance, kind of. You take something from it, or you take something that you should not have taken, and it comes to collect. Something has come to collect, and we are being haunted by this thing. And she's very calm about this. What she's saying is, if we give up, if we give what we owe, it's all gonna be over. And Ball is like, I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to hear that. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. I don't know I'm not hearing this. So there they are at odds again. And while all this is happening, Ball essentially has to go out and try and convey to people, this house does not want us. There's something wrong with this house. There's something in this house. We are being haunted by something, without other people thinking that he's losing his mind, which means he's not one of the good ones, which means he doesn't get the house, which means fuck you, you know? And so that kind of leads me to, what is this film metaphorically about? It's trauma, survivor's guilt, assimilation versus tradition and spirituality, traditional African spirituality as psychosis, and the ghosts of things that you've experienced kind of haunting them and coming to terms with the ghosts of things that you've experienced. It's about living with trauma. They're literally being haunted, literally, and what we are watching as an audience is them literally being haunted by an apeth. But what is happening is that they've experienced something traumatic. They've seen people die. They've barely escaped with their lives. They've lost who we think is their daughter at sea, taking this perilous journey, trying to escape being wiped out, essentially, to move to another country where they have a better chance at not being wiped out. And now they have to live somewhere unfamiliar. They've taken their ghosts, they've taken their demons, they've taken all of that with them to this new space that is not theirs. There's something about haunted houses in films. That's a trope that often happens with haunted houses, is because what makes it horror is that the home space is meant to be the good place where there's laughter and there's love and it's warm and it's yours. More than it's yours, you know? That's a big point, it's yours. But in horror, that kind of gets turned on its head, because now the house is fighting against you. The place that is meant to be your kind of sacred space and your space is actively trying to push you out. Your space is trying to harm you. And that's double here, because Ball is dealing with some patriarchal man bullshit. And I don't really want to gender either of these characters, because I think this is a good example of just how much of of gender is just an arbitrary kind of set of expectations. Because these two characters have essentially been through similar traumas, but the ways in which they're dealing with their traumas are rooted in the ways that they're gendered. So Ball has experienced something traumatic, and now he wants to go on and pretend like it never happened. He wants to assimilate. He wants to be the good one. He wants to move on to the next part. He wants his house to be his house. Because as a man figure, his home, he's meant to be the head of the home. So it undermines his masculinity that his house is trying to kill him, essentially. That he is living in someone else's house, in someone else's country, and he has to play like little African lapdog and roll when they say roll, and play fetch when they say play fetch, and do tricks and shit. And he has to do it with a smile on his face, which if you're like somebody that's attached to your masculinity and attached to those notions of masculinity, that must sting. And Riel is not really doing any of that bullshit. I think that she's a very interesting character, mostly because she's kind of incidentally a woman in a lot of ways, and that's something that's complicated to talk about, because black women and African women especially, if they do have a cultural understanding of gender, when placed in a white supremacist context, they're often ungendered in a lot of ways. I was listening. Okay, yeah. So I don't want to like state that this character like has no gender, because again, that's a loaded discussion when it comes to race and intersectionality. Like, if we're working within like the constructs of like a white supremacist or like a white or a colonial, post-colonial kind of understanding of gender, where womanhood is a certain kind of femininity that's really only afforded to white women, and was kind of taken away from African women during the transatlantic slave trade, because like that is where that comes from, these constructions of womanhood. So yeah, okay, yeah, let's say that she's a woman. I guess she can't move around the same way that he can. He can go to a football club and kind of, even though he is like struggling, I guess, or is not considered a man in the way that other men are considered men, he's able to go to these spaces and find community. Part of it is that he's willing to kind of strip himself of what makes him himself, but also he's the one that people speak to about the house. He's the man of the house. He's the one that people speak to. He's the one that people take more seriously, and he encourages her to go out, but where would she go? She's a black woman, and she doesn't get treated with much respect. When she interacts with white women, they try to engage with her on a level of womanhood, motherhood, femininity, but she doesn't have the same experiences that they do. She's experienced a more visceral form of womanhood. She's experienced a less frilly form of womanhood, a womanhood that exists outside of these like white supremacist notions, these colonial notions of what a woman is and is meant to act like. She's not soft-spoken. She like doesn't pretend like she likes things when she doesn't like them. And part of the tension between this couple is that she's challenging his masculinity, which like deserves to be challenged. He wants to pretend like the traumatic thing hasn't happened. As the story unfolds, we find out that this couple, Ball and Riel, had a child, or what we think was their child, that they traveled with, that they lost at sea. And Riel is wearing a reminder of this child in the form of a necklace, and Ball burns the child when they find out that they're being haunted. Which, like, surprisingly, like, destroying evidence of the trauma does not make the trauma go away, surprisingly. And we find out that this is not their child. This is not their daughter. As they fled Sudan, they needed a child to escape, because the escape route was only letting on children or people with children. So they grabbed a girl, or rather, Ball grabbed a girl. And it turns out that this girl had a mother, and this girl's mother died like in the massacre. And the daughter also died like on the journey. And so the debt that they had to repay is that they like took someone's child so that they could survive. So they're being haunted by trauma and they're being haunted by survivor's guilt, because even though they did do something terrible, they took somebody's child, they did what they did so that they could survive, which is its own kind of trauma. Being faced with an impossible situation, a situation where the ethical decision, the moral decision is not the decision that will like ensure your survival. The ethical decision kind of gets thrown out the window because it's life or death and it's complicated. And what do morals look like and what do ethics look like in crisis, in wartime, in the middle of violence, in the middle of extreme violence? Like if you took their situation and the choice that they had to make to a context, to like a peaceful, more or less a peaceful suburban neighborhood, and you ask people, would you steal someone's child to survive? People would like clutch their pearls and say, of course not, that's a terrible thing to do. But if you're seeing people be killed around you, it's not even a choice, you know? And so they carry that guilt with them. Ball tries to bury that guilt because, again, he's working within kind of these constructs of manhood and how he's meant to not feel his feelings or not meant to process his trauma. And Rial wants to go back, wants to make amends, but is also kind of living in denial of the trauma that she's experienced. Like, if we can only repent, then things will go back and everything will be fine. If we can only face up to what has happened, then it'll all go away. But trauma doesn't go away. You can confront the trauma and you can think about the trauma and you can talk about the trauma, but that doesn't make it disappear. That doesn't disappear it. So the fucking empath comes to collect, and Rial is like, I mean, you know what you have to do. And when it comes down to it, given the choice to kind of go back or to live in a reality where everything is fine, or where everything can be fine and you can go back to the way things were, Rial has to face up to the fact that that's not possible anymore, that there is nothing but forward. Like, obviously she can like self-destruct or whatever. The story has to wrap up. We have to give it an ending, and we can leave it open-ended, and it does kind of end open-ended, but what she chooses is to kill the beast. What she chooses is to kill that guilt, to kind of grapple with that trauma head on. And Ball chooses to also grapple with that trauma head on and say, I did something terrible because I needed to survive, and I cannot ignore what has happened. They like come to a mutual understanding. Ball gives Rial the space to grieve for what has happened, and Rial kind of gives Ball the space to like go like, yeah, I fucked up. And I think that the way that it does, and it kind of reminds me of the Babadook, where the trauma isn't gone, like the ghosts aren't gone, you just live with your ghosts now. In the Babadook, the characters have to live with the grief. It doesn't consume them anymore. It just lives in their basement. They feed it worms. Like, literally, that's what happens. But, like, metaphorically, like, it's about living with your grief and just accepting that, like, this is a part of your life. It may, like, kind of shrink smaller and be more manageable. You manage it and you learn kind of tips to deal with it so that it doesn't grow and it doesn't consume you. And it's the same with his house, where you, like, live with your ghosts now and you don't give them the space to like take over and block you from seeing like what the future could look like and block you from moving forward, but you also don't act like they're not there. And that also makes me think about kind of traditional spirituality versus psychosis, because like the white people around them are convinced that this couple is like going crazy. They're experiencing something very real. You can call it psychosis or you can you can call it trauma or you can call it a fucking empath. Like, what they're experiencing, regardless, is real to them. But the white people around are going like, you guys are clearly traumatized and that's your fault and that's something that you have to deal with and you should do better to get over that shit so you can assimilate and be one of us. Because these structures, especially when it comes to like immigration and being a model minority, these structures don't allow you to be anything other than what you're told is like a good minority or a good refugee or a good person who has experienced trauma. It's sad that you've experienced trauma, but don't act out and you better not like cry in public or whatever, or you better not have a breakdown even though like you've witnessed people die or you've seen horrible things that we couldn't even imagine. And that also makes me think about like how Black mental illness is treated, as opposed to like we're always talking about like normalized mental illness, but usually even when we're talking about mental illness, we're talking about stuff like depression or anxiety, which are like hard, which are not easy to live with, but people don't really have the same patience when it comes to people with psychosis or delusions or schizophrenia, like being people with like psychosis or delusions or schizophrenia, especially because like mental health treatment is not as cut and dry as people like to think. Like people are like, just take your meds and go to a therapist. Okay, girl, like first of all, taking meds is not as simple as like, here are your get better pills and now you're better. It takes so many tries. I know personally, like it takes so many tries to find a medication that works for you, because you try medication 1 and you can't come and you can't sleep. And then you try medication 2 and you can't eat and you feel dead inside. And you try medication 3 and suddenly you're seeing spiders in the corner of your room. Like it's a trial and error. And if you do find the right medication, then it really just only helps you manage the symptoms. It doesn't mean that you're suddenly like better and cured. Because there are no cures. There are just ways to manage. That's worse when you're like a Black body, and people already see you as a threat or already see you as other, and you are experiencing something that others you even further. People have less patience for Black people who experience things like psychosis, even for Black people who experience depression, anxiety. And so it just had me thinking about like how their very real trauma is seen as like inconvenient at best, and like kind of a sign that they're losing it, which they are, which is valid. But there's no space for that. You could also talk about class. Like they're in a neighborhood with mostly poor white people, and these poor white people are like, yo, you better get the fuck out of our neighborhood, you don't belong here. And it's like, none of you belong here, none of you should be here. Like all of you have been pushed to the margins but you just happen to be white, and so like you're not going to be other the same way that they are. There was also like a bit about like diasporic relations where like Rial tries to talk to like some Black British kids and they like mock her accent, which like I get what they were trying to say, but I also feel like we need to talk about how complicated diasporic relationships are. Like yes, there are some issues, but like a lot of these Black British kids have like African moms and dads and uncles and aunties, and I generally don't think we're raised to be like that actively disrespectful to our elders. Like you can be a cunt. Like obviously anyone can be a cunt regardless of who they're raised by, and plenty of people are raised by like Black women and are cunts to Black women. So like I feel like one of my critiques with this film is, or just critiques with films in general that show diasporic relationships, is if you're going to try and show something that's complicated and something that is already so tense as diasporic relationships, you should maybe take the time, there's only so much time, and it was only one scene, but I do want media to be more careful about how it chooses to frame these relationships, because they are so complicated. So complicated. Way more complicated than Group A moves to a different country and suddenly like hates their culture, because there are like plenty of Black British people that like will never let you forget that they have roots in African countries. Like that's true too. Just because I think like in the social media age where like we see these things in media that are boiled down to their like least complicated forms, and then we see these conversations kind of being repeated on social media where they're boiled down even more to like the least complicated forms possible because you only got a couple characters to talk about like, these big things. And so I would like to see media do the work because you do have more space, and the visual language does give you space to show nuance even in expressions, even in without dialogue. It just gives you more space to show complexity. And I think they handled trauma so carefully, more or less. They were pretty careful in how they showed trauma and death, and so I think they could have maybe been more careful about that. I also like, maybe that's just a me thing, but I like feel weirded out when I hear people, even people of African descent. I don't know how to explain this, but when I hear people speaking with an exaggerated version of whatever accent they're meant to be speaking, because it's not like I don't believe you, it's just that I don't believe you. And like when you hear it, you can't unhear it. There are moments when I feel like I should talk differently, and then I hear myself talking, and I'm like, "Girl, you don't talk like that." Like, I feel like maybe I shouldn't. I feel like I should delete that one. I don't know if I want to have that conversation. I think it's a film like worth checking out, especially if you like don't watch a lot of horror films with black people in it, or if you do watch horror films with black people in it, and you're trying to watch something that is not just like recreations essentially of like trauma inflicted to black bodies by white people. I think it's a good, when it comes to handling the theme of like trauma um, and immigration, like it does pretty okay. I would like to see more films in this vein.